people who have completely opposite views on abortion together. Now, usually people who have opposite views on abortion debate the issue. They're considered pro-choice or pro-life people, and they simply argue their case by showing evidence of how their position is better and the position of the other is not. In their attempt, the Public Conversation Project's attempt to move from that debate argumentative mode to a dialogic mode, they invite people first to tell a story about what their personal relationship to the issue of abortion is. And by starting in that place, people tell stories. They tell stories about being raised within a particular religion where abortion is not allowed. They tell stories about being adopted and therefore having a great deal of value invested in being anti-abortion. The stories are telling because they are people's lived experience. And when we hear their stories, we can well understand the position that they take on the issue, so that we can ask questions and we can come to understand in a much more complex and nuanced way how it is that conflict emerges. It doesn't emerge just because of abstract positions. People have very different life paths. And with that new understanding of those different stories that give life to the bigger issues, people start finding a way to connect and talk and be curious and ask questions. It doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't answer the question if abortion is right or wrong, or if any issue is right or wrong, but it allows people to have a way to talk with one another. And one of the ideas behind dialogue is that as long as we can keep in conversation together, we can continue to make meaning together. So if we can open that space through, for example, asking people to bring the stories with them of their lived experience, then we have the possibility of creating a new way of going on together in a community, in a family, in any conflict situation. So stories become important. And the other interesting thing about stories is that I may disagree with your position, I may disagree with the issue that we're in conflict about, but I can never tell you that your story is wrong. That's your story. And so it gives us another way to connect on something that we can disagree on the issue, but we can come to have a more nuanced and interesting conversation about our lived experience. Another resource that I think is extremely important and has been suggested in a lot of what I've said thus far is what I refer to as coordinating multiplicity. In our modernist world, we often are looking for what is the right answer, what is the right way forward, which is the universal truth. However, if we go back to what I said before about the multiplicity of truths, the multiplicity of worldviews circulating, the idea, again, is not to make them all into one, but to, if you have I have an image of juggling, if you could keep them all kind of circulating and find ways to start building bridges between one worldview and another. How do we coordinate all these different views? So if we think about in our professional practice, when we are presented with multiplicity and complexity, we're usually trying to simplify it and bring it down to one agreed upon consensus. And I think consensus can be quite dangerous because consensus means that everybody has come into the conversation with some real passion and devotion to their ideas. But in order to reach consensus, that what everybody can agree on, we pretty much have had to take what we're most passionate and put it aside, and then agree to some things that we don't have that much investment in. So instead of trying to move towards consensus when we confront conflict, instead of trying to get everybody to agree, can we find a way to coordinate multiplicity? Can we find a way, in fact, to celebrate that the world is complex? We don't live in a simple one world, one vision, one objective, universal way of being. We live among multiplicity. We live with difference. So how do we take that fact that we live with diversity and difference and institute it in our everyday practice, where we appreciate difference and we realize that there are differences that need to subtly be negotiated, but we don't need to necessarily start by obliterating difference. Okay, another resource that I think is useful is to recall that if we are part of so many different realities that are constructed, if every time we're coordinating and interacting with others, we are creating a way of being in the world, a set of beliefs and values that we bring, then we ourselves hold on to disparate values. When I'm with this group of people or operating in this community, I may think these things are good, but when I'm in this community operating with these people, I think those very same things are bad. But those are all possibilities, that we have many, many voices. We are multi-beings. So how do we take the resources? We have different resources for interacting in all these different communities that we're part of. One of the reasons we get stuck in conflict is we keep doing the same thing. We do what we do in this community. How can we perhaps use a form of action that's very familiar for us in another community, in this community here? So it may not be a typical way of acting. So how might you, for example, as a professional, work with a family in a way that is more like how you operate with your own family? Okay, so to use another metaphor, perhaps you take off the hat of professional and you put on the hat of family member. And in so doing, you might, in fact, find more resources for continuing that conversation, which, of course, is the bottom line of all of these resources I'm talking about. How do we create the space, that dialogic space, where the relational ethic really is the dominant theme? We want to keep the conversation going so that we can have the possibility to create some new understanding together, which is another important point, I think, that when we think about conflict, we're often thinking about agreement. How do we get people to agree? I think within a relational ethic, within a dialogic stance, what we really want is understanding. How can we come to some new understanding? Not necessarily agreement. When we put agreement as the ultimate end point, we set ourselves up for failure. If we can come to new understanding, we may be able to come to some sort of agreement, which looks very different than the kind of agreement when we have two different worldviews and it's, whose worldview are we going to agree on will win the day. So understanding is what we're looking toward. And there could be multiple understandings. Finally, I wanted to propose that we invite people to imagine the possibilities, imagine what might be possible, rather than focus on the past. Oftentimes, when we confront difference, when we confront conflict, when we confront a crisis or a difficulty of some kind, we engage in a conversation that's focused on the past. When did the problem begin? What do you think causes the problem? What have you tried to do to resolve the problem? Why do you think those attempts have failed? When we engage in that kind of conversation, which is very typical, we invite people into thinking in causal terms, that A causes B, B will cause C. On the other hand, if we invite people to give voice to their imagined futures, how would they like things to be? How would it be if they imagined speaking, acting, engaging with each other in different ways? What would that look like? In asking those sorts of questions, we actually invite people into a moment of construction where they are actively invited to co-construct a preferred future. So I think imagining these possibilities, that kind of conversation, it's not to replace conversation of the past. I think we can still ask about how conflicts have begun, how are our practices not helping us, how could we improve things, what was done in the past. We can ask those questions, we can engage in those conversations, but I think we need to also pay special attention to the way in which we invite people into envisioning the future that they might want to live into. And actually asking quite often about the future can be quite fantastical. It's like a dream, you know, it could be far from what people could imagine in reality. But after people give voice to the dream, we can ask them, how would you begin to move towards that dream? What would be some things that you would do right now? And people are very able to talk about the concrete things that they might do to move forward. So those are just a few thoughts about conflict resolution, or what I prefer to refer to as transformative dialogue, and the way in which transformative dialogue introduces us to a relational ethic where we position ourselves with these resources, imagining possible futures, being critically reflexive, both of our own inner voices and what we're doing with others, coordinating our multiplicity, speaking from stories of our lives as opposed to speaking from abstract values and beliefs. And remembering that all those abstractions of what we hold dearly, what we think is right and wrong, emerge only in the interactions that we have with others and with the traditions and the histories and the cultural ways of being that we live within and among. We bring those into our interactions, we recreate them, or we shift them. This process of constructing our lives is always ongoing. And I think it's very useful for us to hold on to the idea that meaning is really never fixed. Meaning is always on the move. It's always in motion. Sometimes it appears to be fixed and stuck. But if we hold on to this relational ethic, we can move forward because we realize that in every moment we have the possibility of coordinating our activities in new ways that will create new meaning. So I look forward to having a conversation with you and discussing these ideas in a little bit more detail. Thank you.
In other words, is the question how to generate dialogue when the conditions are not conducive to dialogue? Okay, so that's a great question, and by the way, hello everyone, I'm sorry I can't be there. I don't think we should ever assume that we can just introduce dialogue within a group. I think that we need to create conditions where we can have dialogue.
Primero dice que saludos a todos y que no cree que se puedan crear condiciones. Ahora, la pregunta primera era la de cómo crear condiciones de diálogo en un ambiente escolar con adolescentes que tienen dificultades en la convivencia y la diferencia entre géneros. Entonces, está diciendo que no necesariamente se crean condiciones de diálogo para todo un grupo, sino que en general se crean condiciones de diálogo.
So, there are many ways that you can create those conditions. And I think one of the most useful is to to invite people into a conversation about moments when they were able to feel comfortable talking about their differences in a group, for example, and to start sharing stories of when difficulties were not so hard to talk about.
Tal vez una de las mejores maneras es invitar a las personas a hablar sobre las experiencias que han tenido en momentos en los que sí han podido hablar, compartir y en cambio identificar cuáles son los momentos o las situaciones en las que han tenido dificultades o diferencias en ese diálogo.
So that's based on the assumption that everybody, no matter what their differences are, everybody has had opportunities and moments in their lives when they have felt listened to. So if we invite them to start by talking about what that experience was like, we can often create the conditions where they themselves can start listening to each other in a different way.
Todos hemos tenido dificultades en la conversación y al escuchar a los demás. Probablemente lo que hay que hacer es preguntarnos preguntarle a esas personas en qué han consistido esas dificultades y cómo las han enfrentado. Y a partir de allí identificamos cuáles son las verdaderas dificultades.
I think we can also ask people to share their different views of what respect looks like. So if you have a context where people are not particularly respecting each other and their differences, ask them, what are the different views? How do you know when there's respect? How do you know that others are listening to you? And so you generate a conversation about the conditions for dialogue rather than starting a conversation about the issues that are most conflicted for people.
Uno de los puntos que habría que aclarar con las personas es compartir, ponerse de acuerdo en qué sentido se sienten no respetados, cuándo es que no hay respeto del uno al otro, conversar con las personas, invitarlas a conversar acerca de esas dificultades y a partir de eso crear las condiciones para el diálogo una vez tengamos claro cuáles son las situaciones de no respeto y cuáles son las de sí respeto.
Yeah. Okay.
Perdón, para el público, más o menos así. Dada su experiencia, ¿de qué manera podría una familia utilizar el diálogo abierto cuando los niños son pequeños? ¿Cómo incluir a todos los miembros para llegar a un consenso teniendo en cuenta la edad, el género y las maneras de pensar?
Okay, so that's a good question. I think one of the things that we often overlook is how smart children are. They, in my experience, are very capable of participating. And it's only when we treat them as if they are not capable of participating that they, in fact, respond in a like manner. So one thing we can do is just presume that children want to be part of the conversation and are quite capable of being part of it.
Esa pregunta es muy buena. Yo creo que hay que partir de entender que los niños son bastante inteligentes y bastante capaces de hablar y de participar. Precisamente, muchas veces hay conflictos con ellos porque nosotros suponemos, o reaccionan ellos de mala manera porque nosotros suponemos que no son capaces de conversar y que no son capaces de interactuar.
And just another thing to add to that sometimes when children are reluctant, play and art are ways of bringing them into the conversation. And I'm sure many of the people here in the audience are very familiar with using more playful ways to engage children. They can draw a picture and then you can ask them to describe what the picture's about and use that as a way to bring them in and get other family members to participate.
Tal vez muchos de ustedes están familiarizados con que con los niños muchas veces no hay que esperar que hablen los niños pequeños, la utilización de la palabra, sino el arte, los juegos, las situaciones de dibujo, maneras de expresarse, maneras como ellos pueden participar, que muchos de ustedes ya conocen.
Okay.
No sé si había otra pregunta por la...
I didn't catch, I'm not catching the question, Cesar.
Okay.
It's just I can't hear you because I think you're too close to the microphone. Okay, right.
Perdón, excuse me. Bueno, la primera pregunta es si puede hablar un poco más sobre las claves para el entrenamiento de un terapeuta. Y la otra era si podía hablar un poco más sobre el tercer punto de vista, aquel que incluye los otros dos.
Okay, can I start with this answering the second one, which is the third point of view that I was talking about? Okay.
Sobre el tercer punto de vista primero. Okay.
So what I'm talking about is instead of if we simplify conflict, this is just for discussion's sake, to simplify it this way, that we have one point of view and another point of view, and they don't meet. What I'm talking about with the third point of view is if we enter in with respectful curiosity about the difference, about what makes this very different point of view coherent for the people or the person who hold that view, then that invites them to be curious about our point of view. And in doing that, we start building a very different point of view, which is what I was referring to as sort of this third. It's not that one view is right and the other is wrong. It's not that we make them the same. It's that we have little points of touch between the two views that begin to create possibility for you and me to be in conversation and therefore to create new meaning. That new meaning would be the third meaning.
Okay, I'll try. Vamos a intentar, esta idea larga es así. La idea es que en vez de simplificar el conflicto y suponer que hay dos puntos de vista únicamente, pensemos si hay uno tercero y despertemos una especie de curiosidad respetuosa para entender por qué cada uno de los dos puntos de vista es coherente en sí mismo. Y buscamos construir otro, no suponer que el primero es positivo, es correcto y el segundo negativo, o no tratar de igualar esos dos puntos de vista, sino buscar las pequeñas posibilidades de conversar y llegar a un nuevo punto de vista diferente.
Okay, there's a lot more that could be said about that, but in response to the first question of training therapy, I think this is a huge issue, and what I would like to see happen is, I think we need to train people in different philosophical orientations to the world. People need to know the difference between cognitive behavioral therapy and systemic therapy and structural therapy, etc. But what we really need to train people to do is to move in and out of those forms of therapy and not to accept any one as the truth, because any model of therapy, any form of therapy becomes a way to connect with clients. And if a client speaks the language or expects the language of psychoanalysis, we should be able to enter into that way of talking so that we can relationally engage with people to help promote transformation.
El tema del entrenamiento en terapia es un tema muy largo sobre el que se podría hablar mucho. Lo que cree ella es que en principio sí hay que entrenar a los terapeutas en diferentes orientaciones filosóficas, en diferentes tipos de terapias. Por ejemplo, que conozcan la terapia sistémica, las terapias de familia, pero que sean capaces de entrar y salir de esos estilos o de esos tipos de terapia y no aceptar como que haya una sola terapia que sea la verdadera. Tener en cuenta el punto de vista del paciente. Por ejemplo, si el paciente o el consultante habla mucho, piensa mucho en términos de psicoanálisis, usted debería ser capaz de ponerse en la posición de él. Y si es desde otra perspectiva, lo mismo. Primero vamos a formular una pregunta que dice: cuando existen familias que se niegan a establecer espacios de diálogo, ¿qué se podría hacer?
I think that that's a really common situation. People don't really want to. They just want their point of view to be listened to and respected. And so I think, I don't think we need to name things dialogue. I think basically what we need to do is design opportunities that invite people to talk about what's going on for them, to talk about their differences. I wouldn't name what I'm doing with people in this sort of situation as dialogue. I would simply ask them to help me create a space where we can begin to address people's desires and their needs and their problems. So I think basically if we're responsive to different people, they will want to stay in the conversation. If we try to force on them what we think is a preferred way, for example, if we name it, we need to have a dialogue about this, they may feel not listened to or attended to, and so they don't want to participate. So I think it's mostly just being responsive to the other that will open up and create the space where we can then figure out how best to move forward.
Es muy común ese problema de que las familias se nieguen a conversar, a dialogar. Generalmente uno busca que le escuchen su punto de vista, pero lo que propone es que hay que insistir en diálogo, diseñar oportunidades, hacerlos hablar, aceptar las diferencias. Tal vez una manera, una posición del terapeuta es invitar a las personas a que me ayuden a dialogar, a que creemos espacios para mantener esas diferencias, para que puedan cumplir sus deseos, sus necesidades y enfrentar sus problemas. Ser responsivo o responder a ellos, no forzarlos a escuchar, pero sí atender a ellos e invitarlos a mantener ese diálogo.
Coordinating what? Diversity.
Que se podría ampliar sobre la multiplicidad coordinada o diversidad, la diversidad coordinada es. Okay.
Or I also talk about coordinating multiplicity, so I'm not sure that I heard what you were talking about. Multiplicity, okay. Well, I think from a traditional modernist point of view, we are always trying to find what the right answer is and the right way to move forward, the right way to deal with things, and what's the true meaning. In a postmodern world, we recognize that there are so many competing truths and beliefs and values and ways of living. The worldviews are so diverse that instead of trying to figure out which one is right or which one is best, that what we need to do is find a way to allow these differences, this multiplicity of worldviews, to be in conversation with one another. That's what I mean by coordinating multiplicity. The modernist propensity is to make everything the same.
Sí, excúsenme, pero es que estas son ideas complejas que ella se entusiasma y yo me pierdo. Por multiplicidad coordinada, lo que quiere decir es que en la tradición modernizante que tenemos, tendemos a pensar que las cosas se dividen entre correctas e incorrectas y que existe una verdad. Mientras que el punto de vista posmoderno sería que hay múltiples verdades que compiten, hay muchos puntos de vista y hay muchas formas de enfrentar la vida. No estaríamos buscando cuál es correcta e incorrecta, ni siquiera cuál es la mejor, sino habría que permitir que conversen entre ellas y que convivan entre ellas.
No, that's good. I'm sorry. That's good.
Bueno, otra. ¿Cómo se puede imaginar, soñar o pensar una posibilidad de cambio para el futuro cuando el pasado ha causado trauma profundo, dolor, una fuerte carga emocional.